Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a trip back in time to a period full of strange inventions. The kind that were so bizarre you might wonder how anyone survived without modern gadgets. But guess what? These inventions weren't just weird, they were extremely useful. You know, before we had refrigerators, smartphones, or the luxury of instant coffee, people in the medieval period had to get creative. And let's face it, they came up with some truly odd, yet impressive solutions to problems we still face today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. So drop your location and the time there in the comments. I'm curious to know how far my voice is travelling as you wind down for the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're starting with something that could have saved your life in medieval times, and might still be handy today if you were ever stranded in the wilderness: how to make fire. We all know the importance of fire, whether it's for warmth, cooking, or keeping predators away. But imagine living in a time where the only way to create fire was by striking a rock against steel. Yep, that's right. Long before the convenience of matches, medieval people mastered the art of starting fire with flint and steel. And it's a method that could still come in handy today when modern technology fails. The process wasn't easy, though it wasn't just a flick of a bic or a twist of a button. This took skill and precision. You might think, how hard could it be to start a fire? Well, you had to know exactly how to strike the flint against steel in the right way to produce a tiny spark. That spark had to land on something that could catch fire, usually a piece of charred cloth or tinder. And don't get me started on the patience it required to nurture that small spark into a roaring fire, especially when the weather wasn't cooperating. Imagine this: no electricity, no matches, and no lighters. You're relying on two simple tools, a rock and a piece of steel. And not just any rock, a flint rock, which might look like an ordinary stone, but was a key player in medieval life. When struck against steel, the flint would shave off tiny bits of the metal that instantly burst into flame. These sparks were the key to survival without fire. Life would have been much harder. Now, I know what you're thinking, it sounds easy. Right, just hit the steel with the flint and voila, you've got fire. Well, it wasn't quite that simple. It was a little like trying to win a video game that's a lot harder than you imagined, with the added frustration of waiting for the loading screen to vanish after each failed attempt. And let's be honest, there's no pause button. Once you've got that spark, you have to act quickly before it dies out. The trick was using char cloth, a fabric that had been intentionally burned in a low oxygen environment to turn it into a blackened, spark-catching material. Once that spark landed on the char cloth, it would smoulder, giving you a chance to transfer it to a bundle of dry tinder, typically grasses, fungus, or plant fibres. Then came the tricky part: carefully blowing on the glowing embers, coaxing them into a flame. And if you think losing your phone at a concert is bad, imagine how medieval folks felt when they dropped their fire starter kit. That was the equivalent of a teenager losing their phone at a concert, except it was far more serious. Without that fire starter, you could be stuck without warmth or food for the night. Historians still debate whether people in the medieval period fully understood the science behind how flint and steel worked. Did they know that striking the steel would cause tiny bits of the metal to ignite? Or did they just know it worked and relied on the trial and error method to perfect it? Either way, it was a vital skill for survival. And it wasn't just for the common folk. Archaeologists have even discovered fire-starting kits clenched in the hands of fallen soldiers on medieval battlefields. These fire starter kits were so precious that soldiers wouldn't let go of them, even in the heat of battle. But, like many things from the past, This method eventually fell out of fashion, replaced by modern conveniences. And yet, when modern technology fails, or if you're ever stuck out in the wild with no battery life left on your phone, the medieval fire starting technique is still remarkably effective. It's a reminder that sometimes the old ways were more reliable than we give them credit for. Now that we've talked about fire, let's move on to another medieval marvel that was essential to survival food preservation. In the modern world, we have refrigerators and freezers to keep our food from spoiling. But back in the medieval era, people had to rely on other methods. Meat, dairy, and even fruits and vegetables were at the mercy of the seasons. And if they didn't preserve them properly, they'd be gone by the end of winter. So how did people manage to keep their food fresh without the luxury of an electric fridge? They had a trick that would make your grandma proud: salt. Yes, salt. It wasn't just for adding a pinch of flavour to your soup, it was the ultimate preservative that could make meat last for months. Even in the harshest of conditions, medieval people had an understanding of salt that's still relevant today. The process they used to preserve food involved a bit more than just sprinkling salt on the meat. It was a bit of a science, even if they didn't quite understand it as we do today. The method was simple but effective when salt was packed tightly around meat. It drew moisture out through a process called osmosis. Without moisture, harmful bacteria couldn't grow, and the meat stayed edible for much longer. It was the ancient version of what we now call curing, and it was absolutely essential for survival. But it wasn't just meat that needed to be preserved. Salt was also used for fish, cheese, and even vegetables. In fact, salt preservation became so valuable that in many parts of medieval Europe, salt was used as currency. You heard that right. People would trade salt for land, livestock, or even gold. If you lived near a salt mine or had access to seawater, you were in a position of power. Towns with salt resources were often some of the wealthiest in medieval Europe, and those without had to rely on trade to get their hands on the precious mineral. Historians still argue about the exact science behind medieval preservation methods. But what's clear is that they understood the value of salt and bod long before modern refrigeration was even a distant dream. In fact, salt was so important that Roman soldiers were often paid in salt, which is where the word salary comes from. Without salt, the entire medieval food system would have collapsed. Sailors on long voyages relied heavily on salt-preserved meat to keep them nourished on their journeys. They didn't have the convenience of canned food or protein bars. Salt was their lifeline. But the process of preserving meat wasn't as easy as tossing it into a barrel of salt. Oh no, it was much more complicated than that. First, the meat was cut into manageable pieces, with as much fat removed as possible. Fat, after all, spoiled much faster than lean meat. Then came the salting process itself. It wasn't just a light sprinkle of salt over the meat. It was a full-on, thorough coating, ensuring every surface was completely covered. The salted meat was then packed tightly into barrels or crocks, often with additional layers of salt between each piece of meat to preserve it even longer. The salting process was sometimes combined with other preservation techniques, such as smoking or air drying, to further extend the shelf life of the meat. And what's even more impressive is how reliable these preservation methods were. Even in the absence of modern technology, medieval preservation techniques were so effective that they could keep meat edible for months, and sometimes even years, without refrigeration. That meant that when winter came and hunting became difficult, or crops were low, families could still rely on their salted meat supply to survive. But even the best preserved meat wasn't foolproof, and there were times when it ran out. This led to the next vital survival skill, foraging, in medieval Europe. People didn't just sit around waiting for their salted meat to last through the winter. They were out in the forests, fields and streams, gathering wild edibles to supplement their diet. You might think of foraging as something done in desperation, but for medieval people, it was a routine part of life. Depending on the season, foraged plants could make up a third of a peasant family's diet. Wild edibles provided crucial nutrition, and they were often more varied than the foods that people could grow themselves. Historians still argue whether foraging was more of a necessity or a way of life, but it's clear that medieval people had an advanced understanding of the plants around them. They knew exactly which plants were safe to eat and which ones to avoid. The knowledge of wild edibles was passed down through generations, not in books or scientific studies, but through oral tradition, making it an integral part of everyday life. The most famous forage plant, though, has to be the dandelion. Most of us today see dandelions as a nuisance, something that invades our lawns and ruins our pristine gardens. But for medieval people, dandelions were a versatile and nutritious food source. Every part of the plant was used. The leaves were eaten in salads. The roots were roasted to make a coffee-like drink, and the flowers were turned into wine. In fact, the humble dandelion might just be the original zero-waste food. It was essentially a free grocery delivery service, growing in abundance no matter the season. And let's not forget the wild fruits and berries that medieval people relied on during the summer months. Blackberries, elderberries, and wild strawberries were all eagerly picked and consumed. These wild varieties were often smaller than the cultivated ones we find in modern grocery stores, but they packed a much stronger flavour and were far more nutrient dense today. Wild foraging is enjoying a small renaissance among food enthusiasts, but in the medieval era, it was a necessity. Then there were the plants that served dual purposes, both as food and medicine. For example, chickweed wasn't just a salad green, it was also used to treat minor wounds. Plantain leaves could be applied to insect stings or eaten as a nutritious vegetable. Even pine shoots were important in winter months, as they were packed with vitamin C and helped prevent scurvy. Imagine that your survival gear wasn't just your coat and boots. It was also the plants you found growing right outside your door. Historians still debate how much foraging contributed to the medieval diet, but it's clear that it was an essential practice for survival, especially during the colder months when hunting and farming weren't an option. And what's incredible is that many of these foraging practices are still alive today in the form of modern herbalism and sustainable food movements. If medieval people had Pinterest boards, their foraging board would have been the most popular one by far. And that, my friends, brings us to the next survival tool. We've talked about how medieval people created fire and preserved food, but they also had to figure out how to cook all that food. With no fancy kitchen appliances or gas stoves, what did they do? Well, it was time to get creative. And that's where the clay oven comes into play. Now that we've figured out how to preserve and gather food, let's move on to cooking. You might think cooking medieval meals would have been a simple affair. Just throw everything into a pot and hope for the best. But in reality, the cooking process was anything but basic, without modern ovens, gas ranges, or even stovetops. Medieval people had to come up with ingenious ways to cook their meals, and you'd be surprised at how effective their solutions were. Let's talk about the magical world of clay and earth ovens, no electricity, no complicated manuals, just pure, natural, earth-powered cooking. Imagine this: you're in medieval Europe, and it's time to cook dinner. The weather is chilly, your firewood is scarce, and you're far from the luxury of a fast food delivery service. But instead of worrying, you stroll over to your clay oven a structure built out of the most basic materials: mud, straw, and clay. This oven, shaped like a dome, is built right into the ground or against the wall of your home. It's rustic, yes, but incredibly effective. So how does it work? You light a fire inside, just like any other oven, and let the clay walls absorb the heat. The beauty of the clay oven is that it retains heat for hours, unlike modern ovens that need constant reheating. The thick walls of a clay oven slowly release the heat over time, cooking your food efficiently with minimal fuel. You can imagine how helpful this was when wood wasn't exactly in abundance. In fact, these ovens were used for a wide variety of tasks, from baking bread to roasting meats, and even drying fruits and vegetables. Now, let's talk about baking day, because medieval people had a thing for doing everything in batches. On baking day, they would fire up the oven and bake multiple rounds of bread, pies and pastries. After all that, they'd roast meats and cook stews, all without needing to toss in any additional wood or fuel. The oven kept cooking for hours on the residual heat from that initial fire. What modern oven could do that? Oh wait, they can't. The clay ovens were essentially the medieval version of the slow cooker, except instead of worrying about confusing digital settings, medieval bakers just knew how to use their ovens with intuition and a bit of practice. But it wasn't all just about bread and pastries. These ovens were incredibly versatile. People would use them to cook entire meals, roasts, stews, even things like dried fruits to preserve them for the winter months. The flexibility of the clay oven meant that families could prepare meals for the entire week with minimal effort. Imagine not having to cook every single day, but instead doing it all in one go and then storing what you had made. Sounds pretty efficient, doesn't it? Historians still argue about how widespread clay ovens were, but there's no doubt they played an essential role in medieval life. In some areas, these ovens were built into the side of a home's central hearth, while in others, they stood alone in courtyards or communal areas. But what's even more fascinating is how these ovens were often shared by villages. People would bring their dough or food to be cooked in communal ovens, which were heated and maintained by the community. Imagine being part of a neighbourhood where everyone comes together on baking day to make sure no one goes hungry. There's something pretty beautiful about that idea, especially when you consider that it was free from the complexities and costs of modern kitchen appliances. But how did this medieval oven help people survive? Simple, it was a way to cook without wasting energy. You didn't need to keep adding fuel to keep the fire going. The oven's thick walls did all the work, and in return, the oven provided warmth and food without constant effort. And let's not forget, these ovens also helped people preserve food in a way that modern technology still struggles to match. Imagine cooking with only what nature gives you: clay, straw and wood, and turning it into food that could last for days or even weeks. That's a level of efficiency we can barely wrap our heads around in today's fast-paced world. As the centuries passed, the clay oven eventually gave way to modern cooking technology, but the principle of slow cooking and efficient heat retention never really disappeared. In fact, if you visit certain parts of the world today, you might still find people cooking their meals in traditional clay ovens. They've been rediscovered by artisans and chefs looking for a more natural, hands-on way to prepare food that gives it that rich, deep flavour modern ovens can't quite match. Let's move on from the cooking and get to something that really made medieval life more comfortable: storage. No, I'm not talking about your kitchen pantry or that cabinet full of snacks. I'm talking about root cellars, those magical underground spaces that kept food fresh long before we had fancy refrigerators. Imagine not having a fridge, not having a deep freeze, and yet still managing to keep your food fresh for months. Sounds like a superpower, right? Root cellars were cleverly designed, dug into the earth to take advantage of the natural cooling properties of the ground. They were usually built into hillsides or constructed with stone walls and earthen floors. The key to their success: temperature control. A well-constructed root cellar could keep temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, no matter what was happening outside. So, while medieval people were battling freezing cold winters or scorching summers, their root cellars kept their food cool and safe. Root vegetables, like carrots and potatoes, were stored in layers of straw or sand, and fruits like apples and pears could stay fresh for months when individually wrapped. What's even more incredible is how these root cellars weren't just used to store food. They were part of an intricate system that helped people survive harsh conditions without refrigeration. People were forced to get creative in how they preserved food, and the root cellar was the perfect solution. It was like the ancient version of a walk-in cooler, but with no electricity required. Historians still debate the extent to which root cellars were used in the medieval period, but there's no denying their effectiveness. Whether you were a farmer trying to store your harvest or a family preparing for winter, root cellars helped keep food fresh for months. And even today, some off-grid homes and sustainable living enthusiasts are rediscovering this ancient technique, proving that sometimes the old ways really are the best. And if you're wondering whether anyone had a hard time with these underground food vaults, the answer is yes. Medieval kids probably hated being sent down to the root cellar to fetch vegetables, much like how modern teenagers hate bringing groceries in from the car. But with a bit of patience and a flashlight, the root cellar helped ensure that families had enough to eat through the long, cold months of winter. But root cellars weren't the only clever storage techniques that medieval people had up their sleeves. There was also a need to protect their homes and families, which brings us to the escape tunnels built into castles and homes across medieval Europe. Alright, let's switch gears once again this time. We're diving into one of the more fascinating aspects of medieval survival that doesn't get nearly enough attention: hidden passages and escape tunnels. Now, we all love a good secret passage in stories, right? Think of those sneaky trapdoor entrances in castles or hidden staircases behind bookshelves. It sounds like something straight out of a mystery novel. But in the medieval world, escape tunnels were a matter of life and death. These weren't just cool architectural features for drama. They were designed with one goal in mind: survival. Castles, fortresses, and even wealthy manor houses weren't just built for defence. They also needed to provide a means of escape in case things went south. After all, the medieval world was anything but peaceful. Invaders, raiders, and even political uprisings were a constant threat. If you were a noble, a king, or anyone living in a grand estate, the last thing you wanted was to get caught unprepared when an army of enemies came knocking. That's where these ingenious tunnels and secret passageways came into play. But let's face it, they weren't just built for the horror movie moments. They were practical, life-saving escape routes, and in some cases, they were the difference between life and death. Medieval escape tunnels weren't just narrow, hidden passages. They were elaborate systems with multiple functions. Most castles had these secretive escape routes, strategically designed to lead out of the castle and into surrounding forests, hills, or nearby villages. These tunnels were cleverly concealed, often hidden behind walls, under staircases, or beneath large furniture. The entrances were built in places that wouldn't be easily discovered by an invader, but once you knew where to go, they provided a safe passage out. It wasn't all about getting away from enemies, though these passages could also be used to secretly move valuables, people, or important documents to safety when needed. But here's the kicker. The construction of these escape tunnels was remarkably sophisticated. Many of them were long, winding, and extended for hundreds of feet, often leading into woods or other difficult-to-reach places. Some were even designed to confuse pursuers. Narrow corridors, false endings, and dead ends were built intentionally to disorient anyone trying to follow you. If an enemy was chasing you, these tunnels offered the ultimate advantage. You could escape right under their noses without them ever knowing you'd left. The tunnels didn't just exist for people to escape in times of war or conflict. They were also useful during times of political or religious persecution. Think of priest holes, hidden spaces in churches and homes where priests or other religious figures were hidden to avoid capture. The Middle Ages were rife with religious conflict, and many people were targeted for their beliefs. These priest holes were not only cleverly concealed, but they were also often equipped with ventilation systems, allowing the person inside to stay hidden for extended periods. It was a quiet but brilliant way for people to ensure their safety in a world where being caught could mean imprisonment, torture, or worse. But let's not get carried away with just the mystery aspect of these tunnels. These escape routes were incredibly useful in practical, everyday medieval life. The ability to escape a siege or an uprising wasn't just a luxury, it was vital to survival if an enemy army was closing in on a castle. For example, being able to slip out through a secret passage could mean the difference between surrender and escape. These passages were often designed to lead to safe havens or backup fortifications, where the defenders could regroup or find shelter before the battle resumed. In some castles, escape tunnels even connected to waterways, allowing those inside to escape via boats or ships hidden from the enemy's view. Imagine for a moment you're in a medieval castle and an enemy army is surrounding your home. The gates are under siege and there's no way out through the front door. You rush to a hidden staircase, pull open a secret door and slip down into a narrow, winding passage. You move quietly, hoping you won't be caught by your enemies. The passage leads you through underground chambers and into a dense forest, where you can either continue to hide or escape to a nearby village. While the enemy is busy trying to break down the castle's defences, you're already miles away, safe and sound now. That's a serious advantage. Historians still argue about how common these escape tunnels were across medieval Europe. Were they an exclusive feature for only the wealthiest castles? Or were they used by more common folk too? Evidence suggests that these secret passages were not limited to only the royal or aristocratic classes. Smaller towns, manors, and even some villages had their own versions of escape tunnels in some places. These tunnels were used to keep the local population safe during times of unrest or to hide from invading armies. The construction of these tunnels wasn't always as simple as digging a hole in the ground. Often, builders had to be incredibly skilled, as the tunnels had to be structurally sound and functional. You might imagine that a tunnel would just be a hole dug straight into the earth, but in many cases, they were carefully planned with reinforced walls to prevent collapse, or they were built with special features like trapdoors or hidden staircases. Some escape tunnels also included acoustic features, designed to carry sound from one part of the castle to another, confusing the enemy. You could whisper in one area and have your voice heard in a completely different part of the building, throwing off attackers or making it easier to communicate during a siege. Interestingly, many of these tunnels were never meant to be used. That's right, many of the escape tunnels in castles and manor houses were built as deterrents rather than actual escape routes. The idea was to make invaders think that there was an underground route to safety, leading them to waste time trying to find it. In some cases, the tunnels were simply traps intended to confuse or mislead enemies, making them believe that the occupants of the castle had escaped when they had actually remained inside. While these escape routes were incredibly useful during the medieval period, they have also inspired countless legends and stories throughout history, from secret meetings between kings and their allies to daring escapes from enemy forces. Escape tunnels have played a key role in shaping many iconic medieval tales, and let's not forget the fact that some of these tunnels are still being uncovered today. Archaeologists have been unearthing hidden passages for decades, revealing secrets of the past that remained buried for centuries. But what does all this tell us about medieval life? Well, it paints a picture of a world that was far more advanced and adaptable than we sometimes give it credit for. People in the Middle Ages were not just struggling to survive, they were thinking ahead, designing systems to protect themselves, preserve their food, and outsmart their enemies, whether it was predicting the weather, starting a fire with flint and steel, or designing complex escape tunnels. Medieval people knew how to use their resources to stay safe and ensure their survival. Now, let's wrap this up by looking at how all these survival techniques still influence us today. In fact, some of these medieval inventions have been rediscovered and are being used in modern times, often in the most unexpected ways. That's right, whether we're using wool for high-performance outdoor gear or building sustainable homes with techniques from the past. The medieval methods of survival are still alive and well in the 21st century. And that's a reminder that sometimes the old ways really are the best ways. Alright, let's slow things down a bit and switch gears, because we're about to talk about something that's both incredibly practical and strangely overlooked by most people today. Wool. When you think of wool, what comes to mind? Maybe cosy winter sweaters, or perhaps that itchy sweater your grandmother insisted on making for you every Christmas. But wool wasn't just for fashion, it was a survival material, especially during the unpredictable weather of medieval Europe. In fact, medieval people knew something about wool that many of us today have forgotten. Wool was the perfect material for all seasons. It's not just for winter. Wool works in both hot and cold climates, and when properly made, it can keep you warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, this sounds like a wool advertisement, let me explain why this was a literal lifesaver back then. In a world without the luxury of modern technical fabrics or high-tech outdoor gear, wool was the ultimate survival material. It was like the original version of today's moisture wicking, temperature regulating outdoor wear, only far more reliable. And without the high-tech markup, wool has a unique property that makes it stand out from other fibres. It traps air within its fibres. This trapped air provides insulation, keeping you warm in cold temperatures. But here's the catch: wool also allows moisture to evaporate, which helps keep you cool when temperatures rise. Think of it as a magical, all-in-one fabric that adjusts to the climate. This was especially important for the many people who lived in rural areas, working outdoors in all conditions, whether they were shepherds in the chilly mountains or farmers tending to crops in the heat. Wool was the fabric that could keep them comfortable and alive, even when wet. Wool retains its insulating properties, something that cotton, for example, fails to do. Imagine being caught in a sudden downpour, and your cotton shirt is clinging to you, cold and miserable. Wool, on the other hand, would have kept you at least somewhat warm even if it was soaked. Historians still argue over how wool was first used as a fabric for outdoor wear, but there's no doubt that medieval people knew how to make the most of it. In fact, some of the earliest known wool garments date back thousands of years. And by the time medieval Europe rolled around, wool was so important that it was woven into the fabric of everyday life, quite literally. Farmers, blacksmiths, and travellers all relied on wool for warmth. And it wasn't just used for cloaks or coats. Wool tunics and leggings were common attire, as well as hats, gloves, and even socks. In the case of blacksmiths or anyone working near a fire, wool provided a shield against the heat. Think about it, wool was the medieval equivalent of today's expensive outdoor gear, only without the premium price tag. The durability of wool was another key feature. Imagine that you're a peasant in medieval times, and the money you make from farming doesn't exactly flow like wine at a royal banquet. You need your clothes to last, and wool was one of the best investments you could make, with proper care. A wool garment could last for decades. It could be mended, reused, and passed down through generations, unlike modern synthetic fibres, which tend to break down or lose their shape after repeated washing. Wool retained its structure and integrity for much longer. It was like a built-in safety net for your wardrobe. Wear it for years, and it would still hold up. And let's not forget that wool was used across all social classes, from the wealthy nobles to the peasants in the fields. While nobles wore fine woolen garments for warmth and comfort, peasants relied on simple woolen tunics to get them through the workday. The fact that wool was accessible to everyone made it an essential part of medieval life. But let's not get too carried away with just the survival benefits of wool. Wool also had some serious prestige in the medieval world. If you were wearing fine wool, you were considered well off. Some of the best wool came from the sheep in certain regions of Europe, and those who had access to the highest quality wool garments were among the wealthiest in society. In fact, some of the wealthiest towns in medieval Europe thrived on their wool trade. People would travel from far and wide to buy the finest wool, and entire economies were built around this incredibly valuable resource. Towns like London and Florence became wealthier through their wool trade, and people who made and traded wool became important figures in these growing cities. The power of wool wasn't just in its warmth, it was also in its value. Historians still debate whether wool's popularity in medieval times was more due to necessity or luxury. Some argue that wool was the ultimate practical material, whereas others suggest that it became a symbol of status in the growing middle class, whether it was used for survival or status. Wool had undeniable importance in medieval society, and it served as the foundation for much of the European economy during the period. The importance of wool was so significant that, during the 100 Years' War, the English fought to maintain control over wool-producing regions. Knowing just how much the wool trade influenced their wealth and power, and if you think wool was only useful for clothing, think again. People in the medieval period also used wool for insulation in homes and buildings. The thick woolen tapestries and blankets that adorned castles and wealthy homes weren't just for decoration, they served as insulation, keeping the rooms warm during cold winters. Wool wasn't just something you wore, it was something that kept you alive, kept you warm, and kept you from freezing to death in the middle of a brutal winter. So, as much as we love our modern fabrics and fancy outdoor gear, wool was truly the original high-tech material. It was the medieval equivalent of today's synthetic fabrics. Yet it had the timeless ability to regulate body temperature, keep people warm and cool, and protect them from the elements in ways that even modern fabrics still struggle to replicate. But let's not forget that wool wasn't the only survival trick up medieval people's sleeves. They also had to figure out how to store food and protect their homes. Two things we'll dive into next. And no, I'm not talking about tucking away leftovers in the fridge. We're going deeper into the world of root cellars and the ever-important wattle and daub construction. Trust me. These were techniques that could save you from hunger and danger in ways you've probably never imagined. Now that we've talked about wool and how it helped people survive the unpredictable medieval weather, It's time to talk about something that seems a little less glamorous, but was equally crucial: root cellars. No, not your average garden storage shed, but rather a genius underground storage system that medieval people used to keep their food fresh when refrigerators were still thousands of years away from being invented. And these weren't just makeshift holes in the ground. Root cellars were carefully crafted and strategically designed to preserve food for months, making them one of the most important survival innovations of the medieval era. Root cellars were basically nature's refrigerators. They took advantage of the Earth's natural cooling properties to store vegetables, fruits, and even dairy products at a consistent, low temperature, while the rest of the world was shivering from the winter cold or sweltering under summer heat. These clever underground vaults remained at an ideal temperature, around 45 to 55 degrees Celsius, 7 to 13 degrees, no matter the outside weather conditions. This consistency was key for preserving food long term without worrying about spoilage. And when you're relying on what you can grow or store to survive through harsh seasons, this was a game changer. The design of these root cellars was based on the simple yet effective concept of using the ground's natural thermal mass. By digging into the earth, people created cool spaces where temperature fluctuations were minimized. In hillside versions, the entrance to the cellar would be dug into the slope of a hill, and the rest of the space would be carved out horizontally to make the most of the earth's natural insulation. In flatter areas, the design would typically include a deep dugout pit, often lined with stone or wood and covered with a thick layer of soil, grass and brush to seal it off. The materials were cheap, available locally, and incredibly effective. What's even more fascinating is how these root cellars weren't just used to store root vegetables like carrots, potatoes, or beets, hence the name. They also helped preserve fruits such as apples and pears. In fact, if apples were carefully wrapped in newspaper or straw, they could last for several months in these cool, dark conditions, making them a vital source of nutrition during the winter months when fresh produce was hard to come by. The idea was simple: the darker, cooler environment kept the food from decaying too quickly, allowing it to last far beyond the typical harvest season. But it wasn't just fruits and vegetables that benefited from the root cellar. Dairy products, which we often take for granted today, were another important part of the medieval diet. Cheese, milk, and butter could all be stored in these cellars to help extend their shelf life. After all, fresh dairy wouldn't last long without refrigeration, and it was essential for feeding families, especially in rural or remote areas where access to fresh food might be limited for months on end. The root cellar, acting as a natural fridge, kept these products safe from spoilage, giving people one less thing to worry about when the cold months rolled in. Historians still debate the exact construction techniques used to build root cellars, but there's no question that these underground spaces were a crucial part of survival in some places. They were also designed with ventilation systems, simple vents made from stone or clay pipes, ensuring that air could circulate within the space and prevent it from becoming too humid or mouldy. This ventilation was particularly important for preventing the build-up of moisture, which could lead to rot or spoilage, effectively keeping the food in prime condition throughout the colder months. The really wild part about these cellars, they weren't just for food storage. They were a vital part of medieval living in places that didn't have the luxury of consistent harvests or reliable access to fresh produce year-round. This was especially true for farming communities, where long winters and unpredictable weather meant that people needed to stockpile as much food as possible during the growing season. Without root cellars, survival in many areas of medieval Europe would have been next to impossible. people would have been more reliant on hunting and foraging, which wasn't always reliable. The root cellar, however, made it possible to store enough food to last through months of cold, snow, and barren fields. So, as you can imagine, sending someone down to the root cellar to fetch a few vegetables or grab some milk wasn't exactly a simple chore. In fact, medieval kids probably hated this job, much like modern teenagers hate lugging groceries into the house. But the task was even worse because, well, root cellars were often dark, damp, and full of spiders. I can already hear the dramatic gasps from anyone with a fear of creepy crawlies, but even with the gross factor. The root cellar served an essential role in survival both in the medieval world and in the more sustainable, off-grid living we're starting to see today. But what about protecting all that valuable food stored in your root cellar? Well, that's where the wattle and daub construction method came in. This technique wasn't just for making fences or small structures, it was a fundamental part of medieval home construction. And it had major benefits when it came to securing your food and keeping your family safe. Wattle and daub was essentially a method of building walls that involved weaving flexible branches, the wattle into a frame, and then covering the whole thing with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung, the daub. This combination created strong, insulating walls that provided both physical protection and warmth. Not only were wattle and daub homes incredibly sturdy, but they were also surprisingly effective at maintaining internal temperatures, keeping homes warm in winter and cool in summer. In fact, the daub had a thermal mass property similar to that of root cellars, allowing people to stay comfortable without needing a modern heating system. But it wasn't just about warmth. Wattle and daub homes were also a form of defence. In a world where raiders and thieves were a constant threat, it was vital to protect your home and your family. Wattle and daub walls, though not impervious to attack, were difficult to break through. If your walls were well maintained, they provided a strong and effective barrier against unwanted intruders, helping keep your family safe from dangers both human and animal. Historians still debate how widespread wattle and daub was, but the method was certainly more common in rural areas where resources were limited. It was simple, inexpensive, and incredibly effective. If you didn't have access to stone or brick, wattle and daub gave you an affordable way to build sturdy homes that could withstand the test of time. Interestingly, wattle and daub wasn't just used for homes. It was also used to build fortifications, some castles, manor houses, and even church walls were constructed with this method. It's a testament to how versatile this technique was, providing both protection and insulation in the harsh medieval environment. So, while we might not rely on wattle and daub to build our homes today, it's a fascinating reminder that the medieval people were ahead of their time in terms of practical and sustainable living solutions. And while we don't have to worry about using wattle and daub to build our homes or root cellars to store food, we can still learn a thing or two from their ingenuity and resourcefulness. As we move further into the journey of survival techniques from the medieval period, we'll explore yet another impressive tool that helped people thrive in those challenging times. Weather prediction. Now, we all know we can just check our weather apps these days, but imagine trying to predict the weather without any technology. Medieval people didn't have satellites or fancy radar systems, but they had something even more fascinating. Alright, we've covered fire, food preservation, wool, escape tunnels, and even clever ways to store your food. Now it's time to talk about weather prediction. You might be thinking, wait, how did they predict the weather in the medieval days? Well, let's just say that medieval people were not as helpless as we might think when it came to forecasting the weather, and they didn't need to check their phones for a 10-day forecast either. Instead, They relied on natural signs from the world around them, clouds, animals, and even their own bodies to figure out what the weather had in store. Now, imagine yourself in the Middle Ages. You're living in a small village or farming community, and you need to know whether it's safe to plant crops, set out on a journey, or prepare for an incoming storm. Sure, you could take a gamble, but your survival depended on getting it right. You didn't have a fancy weather app to tell you if there was a 40% chance of rain, or if a storm was brewing over the horizon. So how did they do it? The truth is, medieval people were masters of reading natural signs, and many of their weather predictions were surprisingly accurate. They were in tune with their surroundings in a way that many of us are no longer used to. They could look at the sky, watch animal behaviour, and even gauge the pressure in their own bodies to get a pretty good idea of what was coming. Let's start with clouds. Yes, clouds. Medieval weather watchers were experts at interpreting the different types of clouds. For example, low, thick clouds were a pretty reliable indicator that rain was on the way. On the other hand, wispy, high-altitude clouds typically signal fair weather. If you've ever looked up at the sky and seen that classic mackerel sky with clouds that look like fish scales, you might have heard the old saying, mackerel sky, mackerel weather, which meant that rain was likely within 24 hours. It might sound a bit like folklore, but in reality, it's a solid observation. The formation of those clouds is often linked with atmospheric instability, meaning storms are on the way. Historians still argue about how reliable these predictions were in the absence of modern meteorology. But many of these cloud-based forecasts were spot on. The knowledge of cloud patterns, passed down through generations, helped people make decisions about farming, fishing, and even travelling. After all, if you were a farmer, timing the planting of your crops just right could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest and going hungry. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of predicting the weather with satellites, but they did have centuries of observational data, passed down orally. That helped them survive. But clouds weren't the only thing medieval people used to predict. The weather, animals played a huge role as well. If you've ever noticed that birds seem to fly low just before a storm, you might be surprised to know that medieval weather predictors were aware of this long before modern science. Birds flying low often meant that low pressure was moving in, which could indicate that rain was on the way. Cows lying down in the fields. That was another classic sign of impending rain. It turns out that animals, particularly those with highly sensitive instincts, often responded to changes in atmospheric pressure well before humans could notice them. Medieval weather watchers were keen to observe how animals behaved, understanding that these creatures often had a better sense of incoming weather than we give them credit for. Now, don't think medieval people were limited to just watching animals and clouds. They also paid attention to the environment around them, using other natural indicators to predict the weather. The saying, red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in the morning. Sailor take warning is one of the most famous examples. It's a phrase that dates back to the medieval period and reflects the astute observations of early weather watchers. A red sky at sunset often meant dry air, signalling good weather ahead, while a red sky at sunrise indicated moisture-laden air, suggesting that a storm might be on the way. This wasn't just a poetic rhyme, it was based on real, observable patterns in the atmosphere. Now, let's talk about one of the more interesting ways medieval people predicted the weather through their own bodies. Before smartphones and weather stations, people relied on their own senses to gauge shifts in atmospheric pressure. Have you ever felt your joints aching just before a storm, or had that popping feeling in your ears? It turns out that medieval people experienced similar sensations. Joint pain and ear popping were common indicators that a storm was coming, as people with sensitive joints could feel pressure changes long before the storm arrived. These changes in pressure, although subtle, were enough for medieval weather watchers to predict what was coming with surprising accuracy. Historians still debate how much medieval people relied on personal sensations like these, but it's clear that their understanding of the natural world was incredibly sophisticated. They didn't have radar or weather satellites, but they knew enough to understand the signs of changing weather. In a world without the conveniences of modern life, people had to be resourceful and observant to ensure their survival. Knowing when the rain was coming or when it was safe to plant crops was just as important as knowing how to create fire or preserve food. The ability to read nature's clues kept people alive and thriving in an unpredictable world. In fact, many medieval weather prediction methods are still used today, especially by farmers and outdoor enthusiasts who rely on natural signs to forecast the weather. While modern technology has given us an accurate, real-time understanding of weather patterns, the ancient art of reading the sky, watching animals, and paying attention to one's own body still has a place in certain communities. In fact, some people living off the grid or in more rural areas continue to rely on these traditional methods because they have a level of reliability that modern forecasts sometimes lack. And it's not just the farmers and country folk who can appreciate this ancient knowledge. You might be surprised to know that even modern meteorologists acknowledge that certain traditional methods of weather forecasting still hold up. While they may not base their entire forecasts on cloud patterns or bird behaviour, they often find that these old-school methods can provide valuable supplementary data when predicting weather in areas where modern technology might be less effective. But even with all this knowledge of weather prediction, medieval people still face the dangers of extreme weather. And in many cases, they needed to build strong, defensible homes to survive. In fact, one of the greatest survival innovations of the medieval period was the hidden passage or escape tunnel, something we're going to explore next. The weather might have been unpredictable, but at least they could be prepared when it came to keeping their homes safe from unexpected threats. Let's now delve into another aspect of medieval survival that doesn't always get the attention it deserves: shelter building. When we think of medieval homes, the first thing that usually comes to mind are castles and grand stone structures. However, most people in medieval times lived in far simpler dwellings, homes made of natural materials like wood, straw and clay. While they may seem rudimentary by today's standards, medieval shelter building techniques were incredibly advanced for their time. And some of the methods used back then are still being rediscovered today for their sustainability and effectiveness. One of the most widely used techniques for building homes during the medieval period was wattle and daub. This method involved creating a frame from flexible branches, known as the wattle, and then covering it with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung known as the daub. The result was a sturdy and insulated structure that provided warmth in the winter and cooling during the summer months. It was cheap, widely available, and effective. In fact, these houses were so durable that some of them have survived to this day, with portions of medieval villages still standing, their wattle and daub walls telling the story of the past. The process itself was quite labour-intensive, but relatively straightforward. First, workers would build a framework of vertical wooden posts, spaced evenly apart. Then, they would weave long, flexible branches, typically hazel or willow, through the posts to create the wattle part of the wall. This would form a mesh-like structure that could then be covered with the daub mixture. The daub was applied to both sides of the wattle, filling the gaps and creating a solid wall over time. As the daub dried and hardened, it formed a tight seal. protecting the inhabitants from the elements. What made wattle and daub such an effective technique was its natural insulation properties. The thick clay-covered walls could keep homes warm during the harsh winter months, while allowing airflow in the warmer months to prevent overheating. The materials were also locally sourced, meaning that people didn't have to rely on expensive, imported goods. Wattle and daub homes were a great example of how medieval people worked with nature to build homes that were both practical and sustainable. In addition to the wattle and daub technique, medieval homes were often equipped with thatch roofs. Thatch, made from straw, reed or other plant materials, was a common roofing material in the medieval period. The technique of thatching a roof involved layering the material over wooden beams in a way that shed rainwater while providing excellent insulation. Like wattle and daub, thatch was readily available and affordable, making it the ideal choice for the average medieval homeowner. Thatch roofs were incredibly durable and effective at keeping homes dry and warm, but they also required regular maintenance. Thatch could wear out over time due to weathering, especially in areas with a lot of rain or snow. As a result, homeowners needed to rethatch their roofs every few years to ensure their shelter remained functional. Despite this, thatched roofs were a common sight in medieval Europe and were used in everything from cottages to barns to larger manor houses. They offered a simple, natural solution to keeping homes safe from the elements. Interestingly, these methods of shelter building weren't reserved just for peasants. Even castles and grander manor houses used wattle and daub, although in a more refined manner. The walls of castles were often made of stone or brick, but the inner walls, particularly in less formal spaces, were sometimes constructed using wattle and daub. The versatility of this technique allowed it to be adapted for different social classes, and it was a key feature of medieval architecture. In addition to wattle and daub and thatch, medieval builders also employed other techniques to improve the durability and comfort of their homes. Cob walls, made of clay, sand and straw, were another popular building material in medieval times, like wattle and daub. Cob was made from natural materials that were locally sourced, and it provided excellent insulation. Cob houses were built by stacking the clay mixture into walls and allowing them to dry, forming solid, thick walls that could protect against both cold and heat. Cob homes were particularly common in the southwest of England, where the soil was ideal for making the clay mixture. These homes were often built with thick walls and small, narrow windows that helped to conserve heat during the colder months. Some medieval cob houses are still standing today, offering a glimpse into the past and the incredible ingenuity of medieval builders. The concept of building with natural materials wasn't just about practicality, it also played a role in community life. In many rural areas, building a home was a communal effort. Neighbours would come together to help construct homes, and in some cases, entire villages would cooperate to build large, communal structures. This communal approach to building wasn't limited to simple dwellings, it extended to larger projects as well, such as churches and barns. In fact, some medieval churches were built using a combination of wattle and daub and stone, with the wattle and daub sections being used for interior walls and partitions. What's fascinating about medieval shelter building is that it was a highly sustainable practice. Unlike modern building techniques that rely heavily on concrete, steel, and other non-renewable resources, medieval builders used locally sourced, renewable materials. The wood, clay, straw, and thatch used in the construction of homes were all abundant and replenishable resources. This eco-friendly approach to building is something that we are only now beginning to appreciate in the modern world. where the concept of sustainable building practices is gaining traction. In fact, today, there is a growing movement to revive medieval building techniques in the context of sustainable housing. Architects and builders are looking to the past for inspiration, studying how medieval builders used natural materials and simple, efficient techniques to create durable homes. Modern green builders are experimenting with cob, wattle and daub, and other traditional materials as part of the effort to reduce the environmental impact of modern construction. Some even build eco-homes using these ancient methods, incorporating them into modern designs that prioritise sustainability and energy efficiency. But despite these new developments, the reality is that many of the techniques used in medieval shelter construction were far from primitive. They were based on a deep understanding of the environment and the materials available, and they produced homes that were practical, sustainable, and long-lasting. The use of natural insulation, whether from cob walls, wattle and daub, or thatched roofs, was a sophisticated response to the challenges of living in a world without electricity or heating systems. In many ways, medieval builders were ahead of their time, using simple yet effective materials to create homes that could withstand the test of time. As we move forward into the modern world, there's a lot we can learn from medieval construction techniques. In an age where sustainability and environmental consciousness are becoming more important than ever, the ingenuity of medieval builders offers us valuable lessons in how to live in harmony with nature. Whether it's using renewable materials, designing energy-efficient homes, or building with respect for the environment, the medieval world had it right long before sustainability became a buzzword. Now, let's shift our focus to something that might surprise you: herbal remedies. While we often think of medieval medicine as primitive and ineffective, the truth is that people in the Middle Ages were incredibly resourceful when it came to healing. They didn't have modern pharmaceuticals or hospitals, but they had something just as important: an intimate knowledge of the plants and herbs that grew around them. These remedies were essential for everyday survival, and many of the plants they used are still valued today for their medicinal properties. In fact, some of the most effective natural remedies we use today trace their origins back to medieval herbalists. Back in the medieval period, doctors and healers weren't as we picture them today. They didn't have high-tech diagnostic tools or access to fancy equipment. Instead, their knowledge was based on centuries of trial and error, as well as the deep understanding of the plants that grew naturally in their environments. While some of their treatments may seem strange to us today, many of these ancient remedies were surprisingly effective, especially when you consider the lack of modern medical advancements. One of the most famous and versatile medicinal plants of the medieval period was garlic. You've probably heard that garlic has antibacterial properties. But did you know that in medieval times, it was considered a cure-all? Medieval healers used garlic to treat a variety of ailments, from infections to digestive problems. It was even used to purify the blood and improve overall health. The key to garlic's effectiveness lies in allicin, a compound with powerful antimicrobial properties. While medieval people didn't know exactly how allicin worked, they understood that garlic could help fight off infections and improve overall health. In fact, garlic was so revered for its healing powers that it was even used to treat wounds and infections during times of battle. Soldiers would chew raw garlic or use garlic poultices to treat infected wounds, an ancient remedy that worked because garlic's antimicrobial compounds were able to kill harmful bacteria. Of course, garlic wasn't the only plant used for medicinal purposes. Another plant with a long history in medieval medicine is willow bark. If you've ever taken aspirin for a headache, you've used a modern version of an ancient remedy. Willow bark contains salicin, a compound that is chemically similar to aspirin. In medieval times, willow bark was brewed into a bitter tea and used to treat fevers, headaches, and joint pain. While modern medicine has refined the use of salicin into aspirin, the original use of willow bark by medieval healers was remarkably effective in treating pain and inflammation. The knowledge of willow bark's healing properties wasn't just passed down by word of mouth, it was written down in herbals and medical texts, showing how important these remedies were to medieval healthcare. Then there's yarrow, another plant that played a crucial role in medieval healing. Yarrow was used primarily for its ability to stop bleeding and promote wound healing. Soldiers on the battlefield would use dried yarrow to apply pressure to cuts and wounds, and it was even used to treat internal bleeding. It was often called the soldier's wound because of its effectiveness in treating battle injuries. Yarrow contains compounds that help constrict blood vessels, promoting clotting and helping to heal wounds. Modern science has confirmed many of the medicinal benefits of yarrow, and it's still used today in natural medicine for its anti-inflammatory and wound healing properties. Chamomile and mint were also staple herbs in medieval medicine, primarily used to treat digestive problems and sleep disorders. Chamomile was often brewed into a soothing tea and given to children for colic or to adults for insomnia. It was known for its calming effects, which made it a go-to remedy for stress and anxiety. Similarly, mint was used not only to aid digestion, but also to treat headaches and nausea. Its aromatic oils help soothe the stomach and alleviate discomfort, making it a versatile and widely used herb in medieval times. While these herbs might seem commonplace today, in medieval times, they were life-saving remedies. They were not just for comfort or convenience, but for real survival. With no modern antibiotics or advanced medical technology, medieval people relied heavily on what nature provided. What's fascinating is that many of these remedies are still used today, often as part of herbal supplements or teas. Modern researchers have even started studying the medicinal properties of these plants, rediscovering what medieval healers knew centuries ago. But not all medieval remedies were as effective. Some treatments, such as the use of crocodile dung to create a rudimentary form of sunscreen, might make us laugh or cringe today. The idea behind this bizarre remedy was that crocodile dung, when applied to the skin, would protect against the harmful effects of the sun. While it's easy to laugh at these odd practices, it's important to remember that medieval people didn't have access to the scientific knowledge we have today. They were doing the best they could with the resources they had, and some of their strange remedies, though they may seem outlandish, helped them survive in an unforgiving world. Medieval people didn't just rely on these herbal remedies for everyday ailments, they also turned to them in times of crisis, during plagues and pandemics. When disease spread rapidly and medical knowledge was limited, many people turned to herbalists to help them fend off illness. While some of these remedies may not have had the effectiveness we would expect from modern medicine, others likely played a role in boosting the immune system and providing relief from the symptoms of sickness. Some historians argue that the reason some communities fared better during the outbreaks of the Black Death wasn't due to the availability of vaccines or antibiotics, but rather due to their access to these traditional herbal remedies that could boost immunity and help people recover from illness. Historians still argue whether medieval herbal remedies should be seen as primitive or remarkably advanced for their time. Some believe that medieval people were simply using trial and error to find what worked, while others argue that these herbalists were true pioneers in the field of natural medicine. In fact, many modern pharmaceuticals are derived from compounds first discovered in plants like garlic, willow bark, and yarrow. The pharmaceutical industry owes a lot to the knowledge accumulated by medieval healers who experimented with plants and herbs to treat illness and improve health. These remedies weren't just the work of a few rogue herbalists. Many of the medieval herbalists were part of the clergy, monks, and nuns who took it upon themselves to preserve and pass down the knowledge of plants and healing. Monasteries often had extensive gardens of medicinal plants, and many of the earliest herbal texts were written by monks. These texts, often richly illustrated, included detailed descriptions of herbs, their uses, and how to prepare them. As a result, the knowledge of medicinal herbs was preserved and passed down through generations, influencing not only medieval Europe, but the development of medicine in the centuries that followed. Today, as more people turn to natural remedies and sustainable living practices, it's fascinating to see how medieval knowledge of plants and healing is being rediscovered and embraced once again. The interest in herbal medicine, sustainable agriculture, and holistic healing has brought many medieval practices back into the spotlight, proving that sometimes the old ways still have something to teach us in the modern world. As we move on, we'll explore how these medieval inventions not only influence the past, but also have shaped the future, proving that some ideas, no matter how ancient, remain timeless, as we explore the ways medieval people overcame the challenges of their world. It's impossible not to consider the importance of food preservation techniques. Imagine living in a world where refrigeration, freezers, and even canning didn't exist. How would you keep your food fresh for months? Sometimes years, the answer. For medieval people, lay in some surprisingly simple but incredibly effective methods. The key to surviving harsh winters and long periods without fresh food was all about salt and drying, methods that were as practical as they were essential. First, let's dive into one of the oldest forms of food preservation, drying. While today we have dehydrators and modern techniques for preserving food, medieval people relied on a much simpler method, sunlight and air, for many. Drying food was the primary way to ensure a steady food supply throughout the year. From fruits and vegetables to meat and fish, drying was an incredibly versatile and reliable method. The process itself was straightforward but required patience and careful attention. Meat, for example, would be cut into strips and then hung up in a well-ventilated area, often on racks or in smokehouses, where air could circulate freely. Drying meat could take days or even weeks, depending on the thickness of the cuts and the climate. Once the moisture was removed, the meat would be stored in a dry, cool place, often wrapped in cloth or placed in containers. The lack of moisture was the key to preventing bacteria and mould from growing, which meant the meat could last for months, sometimes even over a year, without spoiling. Fish were similarly preserved by drying, but the process was often combined with smoking to impart a unique flavour and enhance preservation. Fishing communities, particularly those near rivers or the coast, relied on smoking as their primary way of storing fish. Salt was often added to the fish before smoking, further extending its shelf life by drawing out moisture and preventing bacterial growth. Smoked and dried fish, such as salted herring, became staples for medieval people, particularly for sailors who needed long-lasting provisions on voyages. Vegetables and fruits also benefited from drying, especially for communities that had to survive long winters. In many cases, people would harvest and dry as much food as possible during the growing season. Herbs, for instance, were dried and stored in jars, or hung in bundles to preserve their flavour and medicinal properties. Apples and pears were often sliced and dried to create a portable, long-lasting snack that could be enjoyed throughout the winter in the medieval period. Dried fruits and vegetables were not just a matter of convenience, they were a vital part of the diet. Next, let's talk about one of the more fascinating aspects of medieval preservation, the use of salt. Salt has been a prized commodity for thousands of years, and in the medieval period, it was absolutely essential for preserving meat, fish, and even vegetables. Salt has the unique ability to draw moisture out of foods, and by doing so, it prevents the growth of bacteria that would cause the food to spoil. The process of salting meat and fish was quite labour-intensive. The meat would be packed with a thick layer of salt, ensuring that every surface was covered. Salted meat would then be packed into barrels or other containers, where it would be left for weeks or months to allow the salt to work its magic. This method was so effective that it could preserve meat for extended periods, even in the absence of refrigeration. It was common for butchers and sailors to rely on salted meat as a primary food source during times when fresh meat wasn't available. The preservation process wasn't limited to just the rich. In fact, salted pork, bacon, and jerky became common foods for medieval peasants, as these foods could be preserved and transported easily. In addition to preserving meat and fish, salt was also used to preserve cheese. Medieval cheesemakers understood the importance of salting cheese to prevent spoilage. By coating cheese with a layer of salt, they could draw out moisture and keep the cheese from going bad over time. This practice led to the development of various types of aged cheeses that were not only flavourful, but also incredibly valuable. Much like salted meat, these cheeses could last for months, making them an important dietary staple during the long winters. What's fascinating about salt is that it was not just a food preservative, it was also a commodity that shaped economies and trade. Entire economies were built around the salt trade, and many medieval towns with access to salt mines or coastal salt flats became wealthy centres of commerce. The city of Venice, for example, controlled one of the largest salt-producing areas in Europe, making it a key player in European trade. Salt taxes, like the infamous gabelle in France, were introduced to regulate the production and sale of salt. These taxes were often deeply unpopular, sparking protests and even revolts, such as the French Revolution. Salt wasn't just used for food preservation, it was also used as currency in some areas. People were paid in salt, and the term salary comes from the Latin word salarium, referring to the payment made to Roman soldiers for the purchase of salt. This connection shows just how highly valued salt was. Without it, survival would have been significantly harder. In fact, in regions where salt was scarce, people had to trade other goods such as livestock, grain, or cloth just to get their hands on this essential preservative. In addition to drying and salting, medieval people also relied on fermentation to preserve food. Fermented foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, and pickled vegetables played a key role in the medieval diet, providing essential nutrients during the long months when fresh food was scarce. The process of fermentation involved allowing beneficial bacteria to break down sugars and other compounds in food, creating lactic acid, which acted as a preservative. Fermented foods were not only an important part of the diet, but they also had significant health benefits. Many historians argue that the consumption of fermented foods helped medieval people stay healthy by introducing beneficial bacteria to the gut, which is crucial for digestion and overall immune function. While medieval people didn't have modern refrigeration, They had a variety of ingenious methods to keep food from spoiling, and these methods became the backbone of survival in a world with limited food resources. The medieval practices of drying, salting, and fermenting food ensured that people could make it through the harsh winters when fresh food was difficult to come by. These preservation methods were not only effective, they were also sustainable. All of these techniques relied on natural resources and were based on principles that are still in use today, whether it's the use of salt in food preservation or the practice of fermenting vegetables. The medieval methods of preserving food continue to influence modern cooking and food storage practices. Even today, we are rediscovering the value of traditional food preservation methods. Many people are turning to sustainable living and off-grid lifestyles, using techniques that medieval people perfected centuries ago in a world that's increasingly focused on sustainability and reducing food waste. The medieval methods of food preservation are not just historically interesting, they are relevant and necessary. As we wrap up this exploration of medieval survival techniques, one thing becomes clear: the ingenuity of the medieval people wasn't limited to the grand castles and magnificent fortresses. It was in the everyday practices, the methods they used to keep their families fed, their homes warm, and their communities thriving. From salt and smoke to fermentation and drying, the medieval world was full of practical innovations that still resonate with us today. As we dive deeper into the resourceful and adaptive nature of medieval survival techniques, it's important to shift our focus to another ingenious, yet often overlooked, aspect of medieval life: weather prediction. Today, we rely on smartphones, satellites, and meteorological data to tell us when it's going to rain, snow, or whether we'll need to bundle up for a cold front. But in medieval times, people didn't have access to all the technological advancements we take for granted today. Instead, they had to rely on nature itself to make sense of the ever-changing weather. Imagine waking up on a crisp morning in medieval Europe. You have no access to weather apps or modern forecasts. You don't have a barometer or radar system to tell you if a storm is coming. But you still need to know when it's time to plant crops, head out on a journey, or prepare for harsh weather. Without the benefit of modern technology, medieval people were incredibly skilled at reading the signs nature provided. They could predict weather patterns with surprising accuracy, skills passed down through generations, rooted in careful observation and knowledge of the natural world around them. Let's start by talking about clouds. Clouds were one of the first things that medieval people learned to interpret, and they could tell a lot about the weather simply by observing them. Low, thick clouds were usually a sign that rain was on the way. This type of cloud, often referred to as nimbostratus, forms when warm air rises and cools, causing moisture to condense into large, heavy clouds that are capable of producing steady precipitation. If medieval weather watchers saw these clouds forming on the horizon, they knew that rain or storms were imminent, and it was time to prepare. On the other hand, wispy, high clouds, such as cirrus clouds, usually indicated fair weather. These clouds are found much higher in the atmosphere and are made up of ice crystals, signalling that the weather is likely to stay clear for the time being. Medieval farmers, who depended on good weather for their crops, would have kept a close eye on these high clouds, knowing they signalled a sunny day ahead. Perhaps one of the most telling cloud formations for medieval weather prediction was the mackerel sky, which looks like the scales of a fish. This distinct pattern of clouds, known as cirrocumulus, often foretold rain within 24 hours. The saying mackerel sky, mackerel weather, was passed down through generations, and even today, It's used by some people who still practice the old ways of weather prediction. These clouds usually form when there's an approaching low-pressure system, which could bring rainfall, thunderstorms, or other adverse weather conditions. Historians still argue about how much medieval people relied on these cloud patterns, but there's no doubt that they had a deep understanding of how the skies behaved and what different cloud types meant for the coming weather. This observational skill was essential for survival, especially for farmers, sailors, and travellers who had to make decisions based on what the skies were telling them. Now, let's move from the skies to the behaviour of animals, another crucial indicator of incoming weather. Modern science has shown that animals are often more sensitive to changes in atmospheric pressure than humans are. Medieval people noticed this long before we understood the science behind it. Birds, for example, would often fly lower when a storm was approaching, as they were responding to changes in air pressure. Medieval weather watchers understood this behaviour and knew that if they saw birds flying low or acting agitated, it was likely that a storm was near. Similarly, cows would sometimes lie down in fields before a rainstorm. This behaviour is linked to changes in atmospheric pressure, which can cause animals to feel more lethargic or uncomfortable. Medieval farmers would observe their cattle closely and take it as a warning to secure their homes or harvest the crops before the rain came. In some areas, people also believed that when cows gathered in groups or faced a particular direction, it was a sign of impending weather change. Birds weren't the only animals that gave clues to the weather. Bees and butterflies were another source of weather wisdom. If you notice bees disappearing from flowers or butterflies retreating to shelter, it was often a sign that a storm was on the horizon. These insects, like many animals, are incredibly sensitive to shifts in the weather, and medieval people paid close attention to these changes in behaviour to make informed decisions about when to venture outside or prepare for bad weather. Besides animals, there were also more human-centred signs that medieval people relied on. Have you ever noticed your body feeling different before a storm? You might experience joint pain, ear popping, or a feeling of heaviness. Well, medieval people weren't strangers to these physical sensations either. Many of them could feel changes in the air pressure, particularly in their joints. People with arthritis or other joint conditions were particularly sensitive to these shifts in pressure and could predict weather changes based on how their bodies reacted. The classic saying, "Red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in the morning." Sailor take warning is another piece of medieval weather wisdom that still holds relevance today. A red sky at night, especially during a sunset, typically indicates that dry, settled weather is coming from the west. This is because of the way sunlight scatters through the atmosphere when the sun is low on the horizon. The light passes through more of the atmosphere, and the longer wavelengths reds and oranges dominate if the sky is red in the morning. However, it typically means that moisture is coming from the east, signalling the approach of a storm or rainy weather. This rhyme, passed down through generations, was an early form of weather forecasting and helped guide farmers and sailors in their decisions. Perhaps one of the more fascinating aspects of medieval weather prediction was their ability to anticipate storms, often days before they hit, by observing changes in wind patterns, temperature, and barometric pressure. Medieval weather watchers could tell if a storm was on the way. They didn't have modern tools like barometers to measure atmospheric pressure, but they understood the signs in the natural world. For example, a sudden drop in temperature often indicated a shift in pressure, which would usually precede a storm. Medieval sailors, who relied on understanding weather patterns to navigate the seas, were especially adept at interpreting these changes. One of the most remarkable things about medieval weather prediction is how accurate it was. Even without the scientific tools we have today, historians still argue over whether medieval people truly understood the principles behind the weather patterns they observed. But there's no doubt that their methods of predicting the weather were surprisingly reliable. These ancient techniques were passed down through oral tradition, from one generation to the next, and in many ways they allowed people to thrive in an unpredictable world. Even today, many farmers, gardeners, and outdoor enthusiasts still rely on traditional weather signs to guide their work. Some of these old weather wisdoms, like watching the sky for red hues at sunset, or listening for changes in animal behaviour, remain part of rural life in many parts of the world. These practices are a testament to the deep connection between medieval people and the environment. They didn't just survive, they thrived by paying close attention to the weather, learning from it, and adapting their lives accordingly. So, while we may not rely on the same methods to forecast the weather today, there's something deeply fascinating and humbling about how medieval people managed to navigate the complexities of the natural world with only their senses and observations. As we continue to innovate and develop technology, it's important to remember that sometimes the simplest tools, like the knowledge passed down from one generation to the next, can be the most powerful. We've spent a lot of time exploring the brilliant survival techniques and ingenious inventions that medieval people used to navigate the hardships of their world. Now, as we fast forward to the present day, it might surprise you to learn that many of these long-forgotten methods and tools are making a comeback in the modern world. Yes, some of the medieval inventions we thought were lost to time are being rediscovered and embraced today, proving that our ancestors were onto something much more genius than we often give them credit for. You might be thinking, how could anything medieval still have relevance in our high-tech, fast-paced world? But here's the thing, many of the solutions that medieval people developed were born out of necessity and ingenuity, which means they were designed to be simple, efficient, and sustainable. In a world that's increasingly focused on sustainability and reducing environmental footprints, it turns out that these centuries-old methods might hold the key to solving some of our modern problems. Take, for example, wattle and daub construction. This method, used to build homes for centuries, involved weaving flexible branches, wattle and coating them with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung daub to form walls. The result was a durable, insulated structure that helped people survive in extreme weather without modern insulation or heating. Fast forward to today, and there's a growing movement to revive wattle and daub construction for eco-friendly housing. Builders and architects are rediscovering the natural, sustainable benefits of this technique, particularly in areas where modern building materials are scarce or too costly. The natural materials used in wattle and daub, like mud and straw, are renewable, affordable, and can be found almost anywhere. Plus, the insulating properties of wattle and daub can reduce the need for heating and cooling, making it a perfect solution for building homes that are energy efficient and environmentally conscious. What's even more exciting is that cob construction, which shares similarities with wattle and daub, is also making a comeback. Cob homes are built by stacking a mixture of clay, sand, and straw to form thick walls that act as natural insulators. These homes are incredibly durable, with some cob houses lasting for hundreds of years, proof of their lasting impact today. Cob construction is being embraced by the off-grid community and eco-builders, who value its low environmental impact and energy efficiency So, the next time you see a modern, sustainable home being built, don't be surprised if it's using techniques that are as old as time itself. Let's also talk about fire starting techniques. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of lighters or matches, so they developed ingenious ways to create fire from basic tools like flint and steel. When struck together, flint would create a spark, which would catch on char cloth, a fabric that has been intentionally charred to make it more flammable, and from there, a fire could be built. This method, while primitive by today's standards, is incredibly reliable and is now experiencing a resurgence among outdoor enthusiasts and survivalists. People are rediscovering the value of using flint and steel in the great outdoors as a sustainable way to start a fire without relying on modern lighters, which often run out of fuel or fail when you need them most. The romanticism of starting a fire the old-fashioned way also taps into a sense of adventure and self-reliance, qualities that are highly valued in the modern age of constant connectivity and convenience. But it's not just primitive survival tools that are seeing a revival. Medieval preservation techniques are also making waves today. The use of salt to preserve food, for instance, is as relevant now as it was back then, while we might have refrigeration and canning. The art of salt curing meat, fish, and even vegetables is being rediscovered by food enthusiasts and chefs who want to preserve foods naturally without relying on chemicals or modern preservatives. The beauty of salt curing is that it draws moisture out of food, preventing bacteria and mold from growing, and allowing food to last for months without refrigeration. In fact, artisanal charcuterie, the practice of making cured meats like prosciutto, salami, and bacon, is making a comeback, and it's built on the same principles that medieval butchers used. The process of salting and curing meat has not only become a culinary trend, but is also embraced as a method of sustainable food preservation, where less food is wasted and flavour is enhanced through time and care, alongside salt preservation. Fermentation is another ancient practice being revived in modern kitchens. Medieval people used fermentation to preserve foods like vegetables, dairy products, and even grains. Foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, and yogurt have made a huge resurgence in recent years, as people are seeking out natural ways to preserve food, while also boosting gut health. The science behind fermentation, allowing beneficial bacteria to break down food and create lactic acid, has been rediscovered in the wellness community, with many touting its digestive benefits. Modern kombucha fermented tea, once a niche health trend, has grown into a global phenomenon, showing just how much of the medieval practice of fermentation has taken hold in our culture today. And let's not forget herbal medicine, another medieval tradition that's undergoing a renaissance in the past. Medieval herbalists knew how to treat everything from common colds to wounds, using plants like garlic, willow bark, and chamomile. Modern herbalists are looking to these old practices for natural remedies that avoid the side effects often found in pharmaceuticals. For example, willow bark, known to contain salicin, the precursor to aspirin, is now being used in teas and tinctures for pain relief and inflammation. Much like it was in medieval times, similarly, chamomile is still commonly used for its calming effects, and garlic continues to be prized for its antibacterial properties. The fact that many modern medicines have their roots in medieval herbal remedies is a testament to how advanced the understanding of plants was at the time. Today, pharmaceutical companies are rediscovering the efficacy of these natural remedies and developing modern drugs from the same plants that medieval healers relied on, even if we don't use garlic for infections anymore. We've certainly learned to appreciate the antimicrobial properties it provides. The root cellar. Once the medieval solution to keeping vegetables fresh through the winter, is another example of medieval innovation that's being rediscovered. In a time when energy efficiency is a top priority, many people are looking to traditional methods for storing food without relying on refrigeration. Root cellars use the Earth's natural cooling properties to keep food fresh for months, making them a great example of sustainable living in rural and off-grid communities. People are once again digging root cellars, relying on this ancient technique to store seasonal harvests and reduce their reliance on electricity. This is particularly true for homesteaders and those focused on local, seasonal eating, as the root cellar ensures a steady supply of fresh produce through the winter without having to waste energy on a refrigerator. In an age where sustainability and environmentally friendly practices are at the forefront of public concern, medieval solutions to everyday problems are gaining relevance once again. These techniques, developed long before the age of plastics, electricity, and fossil fuels, provide modern-day solutions for living more simply, efficiently, and sustainably. Whether it's building homes out of natural materials, using herbal remedies for health, or preserving food without the need for artificial additives, there's something timeless and profound in the way medieval people interacted with their environment. The resurgence of these medieval inventions also speaks to our growing desire to reconnect with the earth, reclaiming simpler, more sustainable practices that allow us to live in harmony with nature. It turns out that our ancestors knew a thing or two about surviving and thriving on this planet, sometimes. The most genius inventions aren't the most complicated, they're the ones that tap into the natural wisdom of the world around us.